Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The contract arrived on a Tuesday, which Cal Mercer had always considered the most honest day of the week, not promising enough to disappoint, not bleak enough to complain about. It came through the agency's standard routing channel, flagged priority, which in Crossbridge Hospitality Solutions' internal language meant the pay was either extraordinary or the situation was, or both. Cal read the figure twice. Then he put down his coffee, read it a third time, and decided that whatever the situation was, it could probably be managed. He had managed situations before. He had worked a fusion restaurant on Titan's lower ring, where the atmospheric recyclers ran warm, and 3 separate species all genuinely believed they had invented fire. A conviction that led to territorial disputes over the kitchen that Cal had navigated with a combination of spatial diplomacy and strategically timed appetizer deliveries. He had staffed the opening gala of a deep-sea resort platform off the coast of what used to be Jakarta, where the structure had developed a subtle list halfway through the evening that the engineers kept insisting was within acceptable parameters, and the guests kept insisting was making their drinks slide. He had, on one occasion, delivered a soufflé at perfect temperature to a table where 2 rival executives were conducting what could only be described as a very quiet war beneath a surface of exquisite manners, and had done it so smoothly that both men had momentarily suspended hostilities to tip him generously. Cal was not a man who reached for the word exceptional when describing himself. He preferred reliable. Reliable paid the same and came with considerably less pressure. The briefing took place aboard a transit hub floating in geostationary orbit above the Pacific, in a conference room that had clearly been chosen for its neutrality. No art on the walls, no regional character in the furniture. The specific anonymity of a space designed to offend no one and comfort no one equally. The woman running the briefing was called Specialist Hode, and she delivered information about alien cultural protocols, the way flight attendants deliver safety demonstrations. With complete seriousness, moderate speed, and the underlying emotional register of someone who sincerely hopes none of this becomes relevant. Cal liked her immediately. He took notes. The event, Hode explained, was a formal binding ceremony belonging to a civilization called the Vithiri, located approximately 1,200 light-years from Earth. A fact that the transit technology made logistically unremarkable, and that Cal's brain chose to simply file without examining too closely, because he had found, in his professional experience, that examining certain facts too closely before a job tended to introduce an unhelpful quality of existential awareness. What mattered was that the Vithiri governed all formal interaction, and she emphasized formal with a weight that suggested it was doing considerable structural work in that sentence. Through something that translated as the architecture of grace, a system of behavioral codes so precise and so politically binding that a misplaced gesture at a Vithiri function was not merely rude, but was, technically, a document, a statement of intent, something that could be cited later. Cal wrote this down and underlined it. He received a laminated chart. It was color-coded, double-sided, and covered 17 species, whose refreshment requirements had been cross-referenced against known chemical incompatibilities, atmospheric sensitivities, and what the footnotes referred to with clinical delicacy as involuntary philosophical revelation. A state, the footnote clarified, triggered in 3 specific species by contact with fermented grain compounds, resulting in the affected individual sitting down in whatever location they currently occupied and spending between 4 and 11 hours, narrating their innermost regrets in a tone of profound acceptance. The footnote recommended maintaining a minimum clearance of 2 meters from these guests when carrying the amber category drinks. Cal studied the chart on the shuttle to the venue with the focused attention of a medical student before an examination, which is to say he studied it as though being wrong would cost him something he valued. The venue was a diplomatic station called the Vithiri Accord Platform, hanging in orbit around a moon whose name his earpiece translated, and his memory immediately released, built in the architectural language of the Vithiri homeworld. Standing in the entry corridor for the first time, Cal had the distinct sensation of being inside a building that had opinions. The ceilings moved in curves that seemed to negotiate with gravity rather than simply accept it. Light came through at angles that shifted as you walked, as though the structure itself was tracking you with ambient, impersonal interest. Everything was made of something slightly too smooth, slightly too considered, with a finish that seemed less like a surface and more like a conclusion. It was, in the most genuine sense, unlike anything he had encountered in a professional context, and Cal stood in it for approximately 30 seconds before locating his professional equilibrium and going to find the service entrance. Beside him, a young man named Petro's first off-world assignment, it showed, looked up at the ceiling for a long moment and then said, very quietly as though speaking to himself, "They said it was a wedding." Cal confirmed that it was. Petros looked at the ceiling again. "Right," Petros said, and then, after a pause, "For who?" Cal checked his briefing notes. "A princess," he said. Her name took 4 seconds to pronounce correctly, and the staff had been instructed not to attempt it. On the laminated chart, she was listed as Hih Valeth. The groom was a dignitary from a neighboring stellar system, a political alliance in matrimonial form, 11 years in the negotiating. Petros considered this information. "So a real wedding," he said, with the tone of someone who had imagined something somewhat less geopolitically significant. Cal said yes, a real wedding, and then asked him to help identify which of the staging tables had been set up in violation of the clearance guidelines on the amber category drinks, because that was an actual problem that required solving before the guests arrived. Petros, to his credit, helped. He also, in the process, managed to stand the chart upside down for 6 minutes without noticing, which Cal chose not to mention, because they were going to be working together for 3 days, and there was no professional advantage in starting with humiliation. They had barely begun, and already Cal suspected the situation was going to ask more of him than the contract had specified. It usually did. He straightened the chart, checked his watch, and went to work. The first morning of the ceremony began at an hour that Cal's body refused to formally acknowledge as morning, insisting instead that it was still the previous night making poor decisions. The station had been running on Vithiri Standard Time since the delegations began arriving, which meant the lighting in the corridors shifted through a cycle that bore only a philosophical relationship to sunrise. And the staff quarters had been allocated according to a rooming logic that placed Cal adjacent to a ventilation shaft that produced, at irregular intervals, a sound like a large and thoughtful animal reconsidering a commitment. He slept 4 hours. He considered this adequate. He had survived Titan on less. The hall was already in motion when Cal arrived at his station, carrying its early morning energy with the particular industry of an occasion that had been 1,200 years in the cultural making and 11 years in the diplomatic making, and was not, under any circumstances, going to be delayed by anything as pedestrian as fatigue. The Vithiri household staff moved through the space with an efficiency so practiced it looked choreographed, adjusting ceremonial arrangements with the calm precision of people who had rehearsed this specific morning many times in their minds before being asked to perform it in reality. Cal watched them for approximately 90 seconds, calibrated his own pace to theirs, and collected his tray. The guests arrived in an order that his briefing notes described as the sequence of approaching dignities, which meant each delegation entered according to a hierarchy so intricate that Specialist Hode had dedicated an entire subsection to it, and then added a footnote that simply read, "Do not attempt to predict it." Cal did not attempt to predict it. He stood at his position in the inner reception corridor and presented refreshments to whoever arrived in whatever order the universe and the Vithiri Court Protocol Department had agreed upon. reading each guest's category from the color-coded system, his earpiece cross-referenced in real time, and letting the laminated chart's weeks of study do the quiet background work it had been prepared to do. The Vithiri moved through the hall with a composure that seemed less like social performance and more like a natural property of their bodies, the way water moves level without trying. Their luminous skin caught the ceremony lighting and held it differently than any material Cal had encountered, not reflective but receptive, as though the light was being considered rather than bounced. He noticed this and filed it under interesting and continued working, because interesting was not a professional category, and the amber tray needed rotating before the third delegation reached his position. He was managing a minor logistical problem near the eastern staging table, Petros had, with the specific talent for innocent catastrophe that was rapidly becoming his defining professional characteristic. Position 2, incompatible refreshment categories, within clearance distance of each other. And Cal was quietly correcting this before any of the relevant guests drew close enough for it to become a diplomatic footnote. When the princess entered the hall, he knew it was her not because of any announcement, though there was an announcement, but because the room changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to and named, but in the way that spaces change when something significant enters them. A subtle redistribution of attention, like iron filings responding to a field. The Vithiri guests nearest the entrance shifted their posture by a degree. The neutral observers turned with the careful casualness of people who were very interested and preferred not to show it. Even the ceremony lighting seemed to make a minor editorial decision. She was standing with her family in the formation his notes called the Sovereign Presentation Cluster, and she was wearing something that Cal's brain kept trying to classify and kept failing, because the material moved with her in a way that suggested it had its own intentions. She was tall. Her hair moved occasionally in ways that had nothing to do with air currents, small, slow movements that seemed connected to interior states rather than external forces, and Cal noticed this and thought, with the specific detachment of a man whose job requires him to observe without interpreting, that it must make privacy somewhat complicated. Beside him, Myra, senior staff, 12 years with Crossbridge, the person the agency sent when they needed someone who had, in her own words, already seen everything twice and stopped being impressed the second time, looked at the princess, and then looked at the man standing 20 feet away in the posture of the intended groom, which was the posture of someone waiting for a transaction to complete. Then she looked at the princess again. She looks sad, Myra said under her breath in the tone of a professional observation that had wandered briefly into human territory. Cal glanced at the princess, then at the groom, then at the princess again. She looks, he said carefully, like someone who has made their peace with a decision. Myra considered this for a moment. That's what I said, she replied. Cal opened his mouth, decided she was correct, and moved through the hall to rotate the amber tray before the second cluster arrived, because the ceremony had another 14 hours ahead of it and he had only just begun. The second day arrived with the quiet menace of a schedule that had been revised overnight. Cal found the updated itinerary slipped under the door of his staff quarters at some hour his watch reported as early, and his body reported as a personal affront, and he lay in the narrow bunk reading it with the flat attention of a man who had long ago accepted that events, given the opportunity, would always escalate. 2 new ritual sequences had been added before the midday position. One of the existing sequences had been subdivided into 3. A footnote at the bottom, in the careful language of Vithiri administrative communication, indicated that the ceremonial atmosphere would be adjusted in the Eastern Hall to accommodate the spiritual requirements of an arriving delegation, and that staff should be aware this adjustment would produce, for humans, a faint sensation of having briefly forgotten something important. Cal read this footnote twice, put the itinerary down, and went to find coffee, which the station provided in a form that was technically coffee in the sense that it was hot, dark, and produced alertness, and in no other sense whatsoever. Petros was already in the service corridor when Cal arrived, looking at his own revised itinerary with the expression of a man encountering a document that has done him a personal wrong. He had also, Cal noticed, arrived to his shift with his earpiece in the wrong ear, which meant his translations were running a 4-second delay on top of the standard 2-second delay, which meant he was functionally operating 6 seconds behind reality at all times. Cal pointed this out. Petros corrected the earpiece, listened to the resulting translation catch up with the previous 6 seconds all at once, and stood very still for a moment processing what sounded like a small, compressed history of the morning's formal declarations arriving simultaneously. "I'm fine," he said, with the specific conviction of someone who was not entirely sure they were fine, but considered it the right professional position to take. Cal handed him the amber tray and told him to stay west of the third partition, away from the atmospheric adjustment zone, and to under no circumstances sample anything from the service staging area without checking the chart first. Petros said he understood. Cal looked at him. "You ate the contemplation concentrate last time," Cal said. Petros said that was different because last time he hadn't known it was there. Cal decided this was, philosophically speaking, almost a valid point, and left it where it was. The second day's ceremonies moved through the hall with a weight and pace that reminded Cal of weather, not dramatic weather, not storms, but the slow, convincing pressure of a front moving in, the kind that changes the air before it changes anything else. The rituals had grown longer, more layered, each sequence carrying the accumulated formality of the ones before it, and the guests had shifted into a register of attention that was different from the reception day's social alertness. They were watching now with the specific focus of people for whom this mattered in ways that exceeded the personal, delegates and dignitaries, for whom this ceremony was also a calculation, a ledger entry, a variable in arrangements that extended far beyond the hall and the station, and possibly, Cal reflected, the stellar system. He moved through them with his characteristic quality of present invisibility, filling, rotating, presenting, maintaining the clearance distances with the unconscious precision of someone who had internalized the chart so completely it had become a form of spatial instinct. It was during the contemplation of approach, a sequence his notes described in language so dense, with V-theory cultural specificity, that he had essentially summarized it to himself as, "Stand still, be quiet, do not gesture," that he became aware of being watched. Not the ambient supervisory attention that guests sometimes turned on service staff, the background monitoring of whether a glass was becoming empty, but something more specific, more deliberate, with a directionality that he could feel without being able to justify feeling. He did not look up immediately. Instead, he completed the rotation of the tray he was holding, checked the position of the nearest guests against the clearance chart running in his memory, and then, with the measured casualness of a professional whose job requires him to be aware of rooms without appearing to survey them, he looked. The princess was watching him. Across the hall, from within the formal geometry of the ceremony's central positioning, her violet eyes had moved away from the ritual unfolding at the dais and were resting on him with a quiet, focused interest that had nothing ambient about it. Cal did what his training told him to do when a senior guest appeared to require attention. He oriented himself toward her at the correct respectful angle, tray presented, expression open and professionally ready. She looked away, back to the ceremony, as though she had not been looking at all except that. Myra appeared at Cal's shoulder during the repositioning interval, collecting empty vessels with the practiced economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times on 4 different planets and possibly a moon. She said nothing for a moment. Then, without looking at him directly, she said, "She's watched you 6 times since the midday sequence." Cal said he was aware of approximately 2 of those occasions. Myra said, "Then you missed 4. She moved away with her tray. Cal stood for a moment in the corridor of ceremony noise and translated ancient declarations, and the distant sound of Petros, apparently navigating a minor cultural misunderstanding near the Western Partition. And he thought about this with the careful, unemotional attention he brought to all professional puzzles. A princess, 3 days from a binding ceremony she had not chosen, watching a waiter she had never addressed directly. He could not find a professional category for it. He filed it under unclear, where it sat with a weight that suggested it was not going to stay filed for long. By the time the second day's final sequence concluded, and the hall emptied into the long corridor of a station night, Cal had covered twice his assigned area, settled 2 service discrepancies before they became visible, and talked Petros down from a moment of atmospheric adjustment-induced existential drift near the eastern hall with 3 sentences and a glass of water. He sat in the staff quarters afterward and looked at the third day's preliminary schedule, which had been delivered with the ominous confidence of a document that knows it is the last one, and read through the binding ceremony sequence with the attention it deserved. Tomorrow the elder would speak. Tomorrow the groom would step forward. Tomorrow the princess would accept. It was all there in the schedule, in the precise, architectural language of an occasion that had been designed by people who assumed they knew how it would go. Cal read it to the end, put it down on the narrow bunk beside him, and looked at the ceiling of his quarters, where the ventilation shaft had resumed its irregular and contemplative sound. He thought briefly about the way her eyes had moved across the room. Then he turned off the light and told himself it was not his problem, which is the kind of thing a person tells themselves just before it becomes entirely their problem. The legal explanation took 3 hours and made the situation feel, with each passing clarification, simultaneously more real and more structurally improbable, which Cal had not previously believed was a quality a situation could possess. He sat in a chamber off the main hall, small, quietly lit, furnished with the V-theory preference for surfaces that seemed to be listening, and listened to a legal official named Arith explain, in the measured tones of a scholar who had waited his entire professional life for precisely this moment, and was trying very hard not to enjoy it visibly, the full juridical architecture of what had just occurred. Outside, through walls that had been built for soundproofing, and were managing it the way a good umbrella manages a serious storm, adequately, without enthusiasm. The diplomatic consequences of the last 20 minutes were producing a sound that had no clean translation in any of Cal's earpieces' 17 active languages, and which he was privately categorizing as many important people, very unhappy all at once. The right of personal selection, Arith explained, was old, older than the current imperial lineage, older than the Accord platform itself, older than the treaty frameworks that made the platform's existence legally coherent. It had been written into V-theory imperial law approximately 1,000 years ago, following a period of politically arranged unions so catastrophically misaligned that the historical record described the era, with what Cal recognized as the particular understatement of a civilization too composed to say what it actually meant, as the season of consequential errors. The legislature of that period had inserted a single escape clause into the binding ceremony code. At the moment of final acceptance, the individual entering an arranged union could invoke the right, name any person present in the ceremony space as an alternative partner, and the new union would be immediately recognized, witnessed, and permanent. The original arrangement would be dissolved. The named individual could not legally decline. It had not been used, Arith said, with the barely contained delight of a legal historian handed a primary source, in 412 years. Cal absorbed this. He absorbed it with the careful, sequential attention of a man whose professional life had trained him to process complicated information in difficult circumstances, without allowing his face to report on the process. He asked, was there a waiting period? There was not. A cooling-off provision? There was not. Any mechanism by which a party who had not been informed this was a possibility could petition for, he used the word annulment, and Arith's translator rendered his question back into V-theory and then returned it to English as something closer to unwitnessing. And Arith explained this was not a legal category that existed. Cal sat with this for a moment. Then he asked if he could speak to the princess. Arith considered the question with the slight pause of someone recalibrating their framing. "She is," Arith said with precision, "your wife. You may speak to her whenever you choose." Cal looked at him. "That didn't answer the question I asked," Cal said. Arith smiled, which on a V-theory face was a more complex arrangement than on a human one, and said that he would see what could be arranged. Through the walls, the sound of consequence continued. The Oreth Compact delegation had, according to the data quietly appearing on Arith's handheld, filed formal objections in 3 escalating registers, each one more architecturally structured than the last, which Cal gathered was the V-theory diplomatic equivalent of raising your voice by very controlled increments. The Emperor Valith's father, whose formal title Cal still could not pronounce, and whose expression, during the 11 seconds before Cal's earpiece had overloaded, had contained enough voltage to power a transit hub, was in closed session. The neutral observer delegations were dividing along lines that Arith summarized, with academic evenness, as those who found the invocation legally fascinating, those who found it politically alarming, and a small coalition of species whose translation infrastructure had not successfully conveyed the concept of accidental groom, and were currently operating under the impression that Cal had won something in a competition, which in a narrow technical sense, Arith noted, was not entirely incorrect. Petros had, before the human staff were escorted from the station for what the removal order described as their comfort, and what Cal understood to mean everyone else's, managed to get a message through on the staff channel. It read, "Bro what?" followed by a quantity of punctuation that suggested Petros had leaned on the keyboard. Cal had read it twice and felt, unexpectedly, better. He was still sitting in the chamber, organizing his thoughts with the methodical quiet of a man who had nothing else currently within his control, when the door opened. Valith entered alone, which Arith had mentioned in passing was itself a statement. V-theory royalty did not move through formal spaces without attendants unless they were making a point, and the point she was making by entering this particular room unaccompanied was one that everyone outside would read and file and remember. She sat across from him without ceremony, which struck Cal as either a tremendous irony or a very deliberate choice, and he decided after a moment that it was both. In the quiet of the chamber, away from the ceremony light and the weight of the gathered hall, she was still extraordinary, but differently. Not the formal grandeur of the sovereign presentation cluster, but something more interior, more present, the specific quality of a person who has done something that cannot be undone, and has made their peace with that before anyone else in the room has caught up. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. This surprised Cal, and then, after a moment, it didn't, because the silence had the texture of 2 people who had spent 3 days in the same room without speaking and had, nonetheless, been paying attention. "You watched me for 3 days, Cal said. It was not quite a question and not quite an accusation and not quite a statement of wonder, but it contained all 3 in roughly equal proportion. "Yes," she said. Her translated voice was careful, precise, neither warm nor cold, but something more useful than either, honest. "I watched you move through a room full of people whose dignity required management," she said, "and you managed it without ever suggesting to any of them that it needed managing. I watched you give the same quality of attention to everyone in this hall, regardless of their rank. I watched you correct your colleagues' errors before anyone with authority noticed them, and I watched you do it in a way that did not make him feel corrected." She paused, "And I watched you read that chart on the first morning with the seriousness of someone who understood that small things, done wrong, become large things." Cal looked at her for a long moment. "You could have introduced yourself," he said. "I was," she said, "determining whether you were worth introducing myself to." Outside, through the walls, the Empire was recalibrating, measuring the distance between what had been planned and what had occurred, doing the slow arithmetic of consequence. Cal felt, with the clarity that sometimes arrives after the adrenaline of an event has finished, and before the full weight of what comes next has landed, that he was different now than he had been 3 days ago, not transformed in any dramatic sense, but shifted, the way a person is shifted by 3 days of sustained attention to other people's dignity. 3 days of doing his specific and undervalued work at the edge of something enormous, and then finding, at the center of that enormous thing, a person who had been watching him do it and had decided it meant something. He had come here to be invisible. She had seen him anyway. "I have a question," Cal said. "One," she said, with a quality in her expression that he was beginning to identify as the V-theory arrangement of dry humor, more interior than a human expression of it, but unmistakably present. "The crackers in the service kitchen," Cal said, "were they yours?" The expression shifted, fractionally. The silver-blue light of her skin did something subtle at the edges of her face. "The service kitchen," she said, "is not technically within my jurisdiction." "That is," Cal said, "the most imperial non-answer I have ever received." The sound that she made then was not quite a laugh but was structurally adjacent to one, and it was completely unguarded, and it was the first entirely unperformed thing he had seen from her in 3 days, and it landed in the chamber with the specific weight of a thing that changes the character of a room simply by occurring in it. Cal stood. He told her he was going to find the kitchen, because she looked like someone who had not eaten since before a very long ceremony, and because making sure people were attended to was, at this point, less a professional habit than simply the way he moved through the world. She looked up at him with those deep violet eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, quietly, that she hoped he understood what came next would not be simple. He said he had read the 47-page non-disclosure agreement. He was familiar with complicated paperwork. She said that what she meant was that her father was going to want to speak with him. Cal picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and said that was fine. He had once managed a table where two executives were quietly threatening each other and had served them both without incident. She considered this. "He controls 43 star systems," she said. Cal nodded. "I'll bring him something to drink," he said. He opened the door. The corridor beyond was full of the noise and motion of an empire adjusting itself around an unexpected variable, and somewhere in it was a kitchen, and somewhere beyond that was everything that came next, complicated, uncharted, unprecedented in 412 years. Cal Mercer straightened his jacket, which was the same jacket he had put on 3 days ago to hold a tray at someone else's wedding, and walked into it.